Kia ora and welcome to What's in Your Kete. I'm your host Jane, and this is the podcast where we share stories that connect us across Moana Nui. Today I'm thrilled to introduce a very special guest joining us all the way from sunny Southern California. She's a filmmaker, creative and academic, and I'm super lucky to call her my friend. Melodie, thank you so much for being here. To kick things off, could you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Kia ora tātou katoa, ko Melodie Turori toko inua no Aitaki, Pukapuka, Tiamane, Sweden, Maiao. Hello, my name is Melodie Turori. I am a Cook Islands artist and educator and academic and practitioner, and I am really stoked to be on Tupe Dreams today with my friend Jane.
You moved to San Diego at a young age. Can you share what that transition was like for you and how you maintained your connection to your Cook Island roots during that time?
Oh, I can't tell you too much about what the transition was like because I was so small. We moved, well, maybe I should start back a little bit further just for context because my story has a lot of movement in it. My dad is from Aitaki and Pukapuka. He was born on Rarotonga, and then he grew up, his family moved to Tamaki Makaurau, so Auckland, when he was like 6 or 7-ish. So he does remember being on the island, but he also is very much an Auckland boy, you know. And then my mom is from Los Angeles, and she's of European ancestry, and they met in Tonga, and they went on at least one date. I'm not sure if they went on two. I never asked. I should ask, but they went on a date together when they were in Tonga. And then they corresponded over long distance phone calls and letters. And this has to be the early 80s because I think they got married in 83. So they got married in San Diego, in Coronado, Hotel Del. And then they immediately moved to Auckland because my dad was in the Army. So he had to finish his service term. And then once he had finished his service, they decided to move home. And they had just had me, so I was 6 weeks old when we moved to San Diego. So I don't remember the transition. I don't remember the transition at all. For all intents and purposes, like San Diego is all I've ever really known as home. And then in terms of like keeping connection, I mean, we really didn't. Like my dad has been the only kind of consistent Cook Islands presence in my life and my siblings' lives. I found out much later, like very recently actually in my adult life, that at the time that we were growing up, there was a little Cook Islands community living in San Diego, but they were living more down towards the main city. And my family lives in the county, so we live out in a more rural area. So we just didn't know that there were other islanders even really that much. Because we live in kind of a semi-rural community out here. So really it was like my dad. And then a couple of times he had some buddies from the Army come to visit. I remember my grandma came to visit. One of his other moms came one time. One of my uncles came out. But then like that's kind of all that we had. And I think a lot of my journey as an adult has been understanding just how much of his Cook Islands-ness my dad did impart on us, because he is who he is. Like he can't be less of himself, and he is an island boy through and through.
So with that all in mind, did your dad teach you the reo or songs, or how did he keep his Cook Island heritage or your Cook Island heritage alive while you were all growing up in San Diego?
I mean, in the most under the radar ways possible, by just being himself. Like I remember he had a really big emphasis on noticing the environment, right? And a really big emphasis on I shouldn't have to tell you what to do. You know what your responsibilities are. You know what your chores are. Like, you're supposed to look around the room and see and notice and then do. Like, and then I also remember things like he was always just really generous. He was always like, we grew up on kind of a farm. We've had small livestock and a garden and an orchard, and my dad's always the first one to be like, "Oh, this person has come over for a brief chat, and would you like some lemons from the tree? Like, here's a bag full of lemons." And I think that's just, it's not something that I understood then, but it's something that I understand now. And I think my dad spent a lot of our childhood really trying to fit in. So if you talk to him, like, he doesn't really have hardly any of the New Zealand accent. He's really made a big effort to drop that, because people had a hard time understanding him, and I'm sure it was pretty difficult in the 90s, being in Southern California. Not like, people don't visually place where you're from. So, like we were talking earlier, he's been mistaken for being Mexican, like, all the time. People walk up to him and start speaking Spanish all the time. So yeah, there's just that kind of like, "Oh, what are you?" And then too, my dad's of that generation that didn't learn Dareo. Like, he remembers his aunties and uncles speaking in Dareo, and he can understand some of it, especially like the longer he's around other speakers. But he doesn't really have it himself, so there was not really anything for him to pass on, unfortunately.
Do you I've got a question for you. So for us down here in the South Pacific and largely most Polynesian homes, do you take your shoes off at the door when you walk into someone's house? Is that something your dad has imparted on you?
Yes, 100%. We were always a shoes off in the house family growing up. Uh,
And compared
yes.
to your American friends that you went to school with, like how has that been for your friends to come over, or when you've been to their homes and you've taken your shoes off at the door or walked in barefoot or socks, whatnot? Have you noticed that
Yeah.
cultural different? What are the cultural differences you notice from America to you knowing,
I mean, I
some
don't
of
think so. We were homeschooled, so we didn't. So a lot of our social interaction came outside of our home and outside of anyone's home. Like, I came at sports. My brothers were Boy Scouts. Came at church. So I think because a lot of our socialization was happening in those situations, I don't think I really noticed that other people did not do that. Not until I was kind of more of an adult, really. And then I was like, this is weird, different. But then also too, my parent, we grew up in a house with carpet, and then when I was like going into college, they re-floored the house and to be tile, and so it's pretty cold, and it's easier to clean, and so then a lot more people were wearing shoes inside the house. I still don't, like, in my little space here. I Shoes are off at the door.
Does your dad still wear jandals? Did you grow up with a jandal culture?
Yes. Oh, well, this is SoCal too. So, like, Southern California is big jandal culture everywhere. Like, I hardly ever wear closed-toed shoes if I don't have to. But I think the thing that like really sets the deal for me is, like, last summer my dad was doing some work on the house, and they were rebuilding the deck and like the patio cover, and he was out there with this like machine that he had rented from one of the hardware stores, and it was like this crank that lifted these giant beams up into place, and it was heavy machinery, right? But he was operating it by himself, and he was operating it in his jandals. I was like, I took a picture of him on my phone, because I was like, this is the quintessential like island man. I remember being on Rarotonga and just seeing people doing these intense construction things, jackhammers and doing all these crazy things. Where here in America, people be like, you need steel-toed boots to do that. On Rarotonga, they're in their jandals. So, like, for me, that's, yeah. full on jandals are for all things.
Can you tell me when did you first go back to the Cook Islands, and how was that experience for you?
We went back. I was 22, 21. I was 21 or 22 when we went back the first time. My parents decided that they were going to take each of their kids back when they were older, like old enough to appreciate and be able to meet the family and kind of have an awareness of what a trip, like the magnitude of a trip like that. So I was about 21 or 22, and then my next brother in line, he was 19-ish, and so it was the two of us and my dad, and we went. It was like this whirlwind because we were trying to see all the family. So we went to Rarotonga, we went to Aitutaki, and all total in the Cook Islands we were there for 5 days, I think, which is just an impossibly small amount of time. And then we went to Aotearoa, and we saw all the family there because his brothers are there, a lot of his cousins and his aunties and uncles. And then we went to Australia because that's where my Nana was at the time. So it was a lot. And that trip really, it changed my life totally. Even though I don't think I fully understood that it had at the time. One of my favorite stories from that trip is when we were growing up, my mom would say like, "Oh, well, you're related to everyone." And I will say, like, kind of to your earlier question, we didn't really even know that we were from the Cook Islands until I was in like high school. Because my dad had only a few stories that he would tell about growing up. They all happened in Auckland. And so we just kind of assumed that we were Maori from New Zealand. And then I said something about it one day when I was, maybe like 16, 17, like, "Oh yeah, like we're from New Zealand." And my mom looked at me and she's like, "No, you're not. You're from the Cook Islands." And we're like, "Where is that?" So even going on this trip, like it was kind of a fairly recent revelation that this is where we were from. And at the time, the internet was still pretty early days. And so there was not a lot that you could find online. There's not a lot in our other main source of information at the time, which would be encyclopedias. Not that much about the Cook Islands. And so we really didn't know that much. And my mom would say, "Well, you just related to everyone." And, we're from kind of a small town, and that we're not even related to everyone here. So that seemed like a really huge exaggeration. But we get there, we get off the plane, we're at the back of the plane, so we're like one of the last ones off, one of the last ones to go through customs in Rarotonga, because that was our first stop on this trip. And the gate agent takes my dad's passport, opens it, looks at him, and kind of puts her head to the side and goes, "I think we're related." And my brother and I like looked at each other, and our jaws just dropped. We were like, "Oh, she wasn't lying. This is crazy." Sure enough, she was married. Her husband was one of my dad's nephews. So he was the son of one of his first cousins, who's basically his brother. And so within like 15, 20 minutes, or at least that's what it seemed like to me, within 20 minutes of going through customs, here's his cousin rolling up in a truck. And no one knew that we were coming. He didn't really know who was around, and he hadn't made a huge effort to kind of lay things out ahead of time because it was a lot more difficult then, right? This was like 2006, so still kind of long distance phone calls, difficulties, and all that. So we were in a pickup truck. We were like, and then we're doing the round the island trip, right? That 45-minute drive, and just like thrown immediately into island culture. And so it was just this like whirlwind of meeting people. And for a long time I tried to like write down names, but then I couldn't spell any of the names. I could barely, and I didn't want to be kept saying like, what did you say? Like, sorry, what was your name again? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Like to my American ears and my American tongue, it was overwhelming, but I think ultimately a good kind of overwhelming.
Like, can you describe what you saw when you first landed? Like, first off, landing in the Cook Islands, getting in this car and going around that 45-minute drive around the island. What did you make of island life or being on a island that you couldn't research or you had not, how,
Yeah, that
yeah.
was our first time being on any kind of island, really. And it just, like where we grow up, there's always this contrast when I have family from overseas come here because it's so big, right? And in Southern California, it's a big driving culture. Stuff is far away, but it's not a big deal. You just drive. So like we measure distance and time, like how long is it going to take to get there versus, you know, kilometers or miles. And so like being able to drive around the entirety of a piece of land in under an hour was crazy. It's like almost 30 minutes to the grocery store from where I grew up driving. So that was just like wow. And then the color of the water, like that blue, the turquoise, the lagoon. We'd never seen a lagoon in person before. You see it in pictures, but and we'd seen the travel brochures when we were planning the trip, and it's just like it feels unreal. It feels kind of fake almost because it's so different from where we grew up. And San Diego's like high desert. It's very dry here. Uh, a lot of the year, most of the landscape is different shades of brown.
Oh,
It's one thing
wow,
that
yeah.
my cousins,
So that,
when my cousins in New Zealand, they remember like they remember me and my brother staring out the window, and we just kept saying like, "It's so green, it's so green." Never didn't know that there were like these colors of green in the world because we really hadn't been very far outside of Southern California.
what I must admit, and I'm used to, seeing the green around here being in lush Aotearoa. And when I have been elsewhere, when there's been a concrete jungle, like, yeah, going further ashore, and when you don't have what you see every day, absolutely that contrast would have been a big mind trip. So, yeah, well, even coming to Aotearoa, can you tell us more about the seeing the green and or how overwhelmed were you with all your cousins? Did you have all your cousins turn up to your one auntie's house and welcome you?
Not really. We did a tour.
Did
And that was
around
that was something that we didn't really understand about my dad either. He We knew that he had grown up in a few different houses with different family. We just had no concept for how expansive his family is, how expansive our family is. Even it, like my first cousins, but his cousins, and how like this is his auntie, but he thinks of his auntie as his mom. And these are the two aunties that he kind of grew up with. He didn't grow up with his mom because his parents separated, and like that, even that idea is a little bit foreign to us because in America, like your parents are your parents. You call your aunts and uncles aunts and uncles. You don't think of them as essentially your parents' siblings. They're like your aunts and your uncles in this a different relationship, and like a little bit more formal. And your cousins are your cousins. They're not like pseudo siblings really. Although that was different for us because we did grow up next door to my mom's brother, and so her like our cousins that we grew up next to door to each other, like they're our siblings, really. But other than that, like the whole experience was just like I said, it was overwhelming. Like we would just every single day it was something new, and it was like meeting my dad for the first time, really, because I think a lot of what I thought about my dad when I was growing up was he just seemed so odd or weird, right? Like that's probably the word I would have used. Like he was so different from literally everyone else that I knew. But then not so it wasn't just going to these places, it was hearing how many more stories he had than the two or three that he would tell us growing up. He had more stories because we would go to a place or we'd drive down a street and he'd say like, oh, this is, I went to that school from this is the ages that I was, and this is the brother that was with me, and I had this friend who lived down the street and he was Indian, and so his mom made curry all the time, and so I remember like we'd walk down the street and we'd smell curry and we were going to my friend's house, like all of these stories that like they made him a person, really, because he had just kind of been my dad, who I didn't always necessarily get along with, and now he was like becoming this fully realized person with family, and how his family treated him, like that was different too, right? Because I had only really ever seen him here with my mom's family, with her siblings and with her parents, and that's a very different kind of relationship and environment for him to be in than for him to be with people who knew him when he was small.
How did you enjoy your food or the Cook Island food? Like in the Cook Islands and also here, how did you and your brothers react, yeah, to Cook Island food?
Very different. I will say that is the one piece of culture that we did always have growing up. My dad's favorite dish is poke, not the Hawaiian kind, the Cook Islands kind. Here you have to specify because you say poke, and then people go, "Oh, raw fish." Like, no, 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 not that kind. Um, so that was his favorite dish. So when my parents lived in New Zealand, my mom learned how to make it from my nana. So we did grow up having poke occasionally, and like coconut rolls, pani popo. So like those two things we were already familiar with. The donuts, you can never forget the Cook Island donuts. Um, Amazing. The fish, I had never eaten fish. That I was not really a big fish fan, but the freshness of it, unmatched, totally unmatched. The taro was very different. That was kind of tough. Like these are a lot of things that were like the first time you have them, you're just like, and to be in that environment too, to be so overwhelmed by everything else that was happening, and then here's all this new food, and so like I don't think I always appreciated it in that on that trip, but there's definitely things that I've grown to appreciate as I've eaten them more over time.
So yeah, I mean, I met you. I think it's been about 8, almost 9 years ago now, at the
Yeah.
Pacifica Arts Whanau here in Auckland, at the Pacifica Arts Centre, and you'd come down for that trip, or for that Whanau in particular. Now, I was
Yeah.
so amazed when you told me where you were from that you were driving from Mangere, no, Otara. Were you staying with your auntie
Yeah.
in Otara?
Otara. Yeah.
Otara in particular, and you'd driven yourself all the way to the other side of, yeah, to Corbin's estate, to the Pacifica Mama's venue, and I could not believe that you'd done that. So, I mean, how did you even get into that? Like driving on the other side of the road and coming from the south side to the west side.
That's funny. I didn't think too much of it. I So the first time we went over, I didn't drive at all. My dad did all the driving, really. And I think my brother drove one time in when we were on Aotearoa for a short piece. And then I just didn't drive at all because I think we were driving a manual transmission car, and I'm not good at driving a manual car. I need to learn. I need to learn so that it's easier for me when I come over. Actually, that's definitely on my to-do list. Yeah, because I drive so much in California. So like I finished my undergraduate degree in a place that was basically 2 hours from my home, and I would go home every other weekend, which is like 4 hours round trip, right? So I'd go home on like a Friday evening, and then I would drive back Sunday night. And like I said, like growing up, the grocery store was, almost 30 minutes away. And Southern California is like big driving culture. And so I just always have driven myself everywhere. And because I live kind of further than a lot of other people, like not in a super urban area, so my drive is always longer than everyone else's. It just didn't even really occur to me like I wanted to go to the funnel, and I was not going to inconvenience my family by having, because I knew how far it was, right? Like I looked it up on the map and was like, oh, that's a good distance. But my uncle and auntie were really generous in letting me borrow one of their cars. Like imagine trusting someone who's never really driven on the left side of the road with your car.
Yeah, I was really impressed with your auntie and uncle. Just thinking, there's no way my parents would have lent out their car to anyone, let alone a niece from the other side of the world who doesn't know how to drive on our side of the road. I was super impressed with that. You managed to find the venue and, of course, through technology, but just to drive yourself there, like, wow, that was impressive.
Well, I tell people now who are going overseas and they ask me like, "Oh, what is it like driving?" And I say it's totally fine if you're in a city because there's so much traffic that your brain doesn't let you be drift into the wrong lane because there's cars there and you're not going to, but it's on the country roads and the places where there's less traffic that you have to be really sharp and really on your game because that's where you find yourself drifting a bit and you're like, "Ooh, scary."
What else do you like, down here in the Pacific? Are there other things that you noticed and would like to know more? Or, yeah, what are your other observations or takeaways from spending time down here at Aotearoa and in the Cook Islands?
I mean, honestly, everything. I think I feel the most myself when I am in Aotearoa or when I'm on island. I just, I think it just suits me. Like, I've tried for a long time to really explain or like have some kind of reasonable explanation for why I feel so deeply connected to Aotearoa and also, of course, the islands because that is my ancestral homeland. And I have come to this place where I just can't really. It's inexplicable in a way that makes sense to the Western mind. Yeah, I only spent 6 weeks in Aotearoa, but I'll tell you the last time that I was down for that last fono, I remember, and this is before I kind of had gotten into any real like indigenous theory or thinking and non-Western, more circular philosophies. I remember we were flying as we were landing in Auckland, and the first spot of the mountains was Mangabe as we were coming down to land. And I remember thinking, I think those mountains are happy to see me again. And I was like, oh, what a what a silly thought. Um, but really, like, yeah, I just think I'm a lot more like my dad than I thought I ever was as a kid. And there's just something about those places that really speak to me on a bone deep, blood deep level. And I don't think that there's a way to explain that in a academic or scientific way. Like it doesn't make sense really from a Western perspective, but it's what I know in my heart.
Absolutely. And I like that you say it was the Mangere Maunga that was happy to see you, and I believe it was that feeling you got there. Um, I understand that.
Yeah, it's like it's if you haven't experienced it something like that or had a moment like that, it's really difficult to explain to other people. And I had something very similar happen. Well, actually, more even deeper than that. Experience coming into Auckland when the first time that I was on Aitutaki, I happened to be on the beach for alone. For a small period of time. My dad and my brother had gone somewhere else, and I had this incredible moment that was everything that was beautiful and everything that is sad and deep, and I never could never have quite the right words for it, but I've written about it a little bit in my master's thesis. But that's the moment that like haunted me for years because I just felt so at home and then so sad, and like now I understand it as the island recognizing me as its descendant and welcoming me back, but like I had nowhere near the language or philosophies to be able to.
I think that spirituality that you described there, I think many Indigenous people will understand that. They're really hard to put it into words when you have these feelings these emotions. We were connected to the whenua. We're connected to moana as well, to the maunga, to the air. So yeah, I think this would be your ancestors all sort of coming back into you as well. Perhaps, I'm not saying it was, but just a mixture of feelings or things. Yeah, absolutely. And then being your first times back to your whenua as well and back down under, how special and brilliant to hear and to know that, these are the experience. This is the experience you had, because it is really hard to put into words.
I mean, mountains are special. Like, land is special. It has there's all this spirituality to our landscapes and our seascapes that we just don't recognize when we spend so much time and have so much education in Western ways of thinking. It's just not natural to our Pacific ways of thinking. And one of the things that I'm really happy I got to do on the last couple of trips back to Aotearoa is spend a lot of time walking the maungas. I didn't have money to do anything else except borrow the car and pay for some gas. And like, what are free things I can do while I wait to see the fono or to like meet with someone and have a coffee? It's like, oh, I can go walk the trails. That's free. And so I've walked quite a few of the maunga in Tamaki, and it's been a really beautiful experience to get to know the land in that way.
And Rarotonga, have you walked the needle? Have you done that walking track up the needle?
I have not. Um, there's just never. It's not been the right time. I really wanted to last summer, but I had a knee injury. Walking on the beach was not always super pleasant, so I was not about to try the needle, but someday.
I've seen some really impressive photos and people going up there, and my niece in particular. Shout out to Ernestina Maro. Um, yeah, that girl's been up to the needle and she makes it look effortless. And then I've asked other friends of mine, and they're like, "Oh no, that's a walk. That's a." And they're like, "That's a hike. It's a hike for sure." And I'm not a walker. I'm not a trekker, and don't care for it. But I have a very close friend of mine, another Cook Island friend. Shout out to Diane, who loves to go walking all around the Motu when she is at home in the Cook Islands. So she will love you and take you up on the needle. I'm just going to put it out there now. Diane, when you hear this, you're going to have to take Melody up to the needle or along that track or one of your other tracks around the
Perfect. I'm gonna
around the
start
Motu.
training.
Yes, because I know that, yeah, Diana's a. I did say to her the other day, I know someone who will like doing these long walks with you. It won't be me, but there'll be someone else here for you. I'll save a spot on the beach and I'll look after our gear. I'll pick you guys up when you're ready. But
There we go.
seeing your connection to the whenua, yeah, that could be maybe, well, you don't even have to walk the needle. Maybe you can just walk part of the trek the next time you're back home. Hey, Bon, tell me more about your film work and your creative side. Like, I know you've made a short film.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose I've technically made a few
You've made
through
a few.
work,
Yeah.
but I have one that did a little festival circuit, so I'm really proud of that. I did my undergrad in film, cinema, and media arts, and thought I wanted to work in Hollywood for a while, and then ended up working on my own. So I did radio work in college, and I did, like freelance media production, so more video based stuff, and did that for like, 10 years, and then made a little bit of a pivot, started teaching. So I teach radio broadcasting now, and that's a really fun creative outlet for me because I love radio as a medium, and getting to help students kind of tap in and find their voice and find their presence on air and be able to communicate or improve their communication skills is really fun and really rewarding. And that in turn has given me space to do more work that's important to me when you're freelancing, you just got to pay the bills. And so you kind of have to, you can't really afford to be too picky about the projects that you do. You just, you need a job. But being able to have kind of like my main income through teaching has really freed me up to do stuff that is important to me, which turns out is almost always cultural stuff. So I finished a documentary called The Future Behind Us, which is about a program called Pasifika Transmissions, which happened at the Pacific Island Ethnic Art Museum in Long Beach, which is the only museum of its kind in the US, in the continental United States, contiguous, that is dedicated to Pacific arts. So through Pacifica Transmissions was a program at that museum, which we call lovingly PIAM. Mickey Davis was the co-curator, co-producer of that program, along with Auntie Fran Lujan, who is the museum director. And I was one of the featured artists there. So that's kind of how I got connected, is I was one of the artists that participated in Pacifica Transmissions, but it was during COVID, and it was a way to kind of make the museum accessible to families, via like a Facebook Live stream. And so the documentary ended up being about that program, and the learnings that came out of it, I think, were more than maybe what were initially anticipated or planned for. And initially I thought I was just actually making a little recap video, and Piam was going to post it on their website, and that would be the end of that. I've made tons of videos like that before. And then I finished the first cut. I sent it to Auntie Fran, and she texted me back, and she there was no question. She just said, "Plan to submit this to the LA Asian and Pacific Film Festival." And I was like, "Oh, I would have made different choices if I had thought that I was going to be submitting this to a film festival." But thank God for our elders who see more in our work than we can see sometimes. I submitted last minute submission. I think I submitted on like the last day that you could submit. I was very fortunate to be selected to screen at that year's film festival. And then I got kind of brave. A new friend, Misa Tupo, who's a new emerging filmmaker in his own right, was like, "Oh yeah, why don't you submit it to HIF, the film festival in Hawaii, and you can submit it other places. Like, why not?" And I was like, "Yeah, actually, why not? Why not?" So I did, and then it played at Pacifica Film Fest in Sydney, which I was really happy about, and it also played at Maoriland, and that was 2023. Yeah, it was last year. Played at Maoriland last year in 2023. So those are the 3 festivals that it made it into, and I'm just really proud of that. Like, of all the places to have a film screen, those are the 3 places for that story to be. I think that's where its main audience was.
Well, kia ora from having it screened at Māori
I should send
land.
it to you. I keep meaning to. I need to make it public. I need to make it public on YouTube. Is what needs to happen. I just haven't gotten around to it, but I'll send you the
Yes,
link.
please. Would love to see it. Would love to showcase it, obviously, on the website as well, and push towards your if you put it somewhere, and I'll push towards
It's
it.
so
Would love.
funny, right? It's 5 minutes flat. It's so short, and it was a very like nakao, heart-centered piece of work. We were talking about no shoes or like jandals earlier. I walked around the interior of Piam, doing some beauty shots barefoot, and I was like, "This is so great." I've never filmed anything barefoot before. This feels so liberating, because the first thing they teach you in film school, in a film class, is never wear open-toed shoes on set. It's too dangerous. And I was like, this is full island style filmmaking.
Absolutely. And that was going to be one of my questions too. How does your heritage or your Cook Island heritage influence your creative process? Like, knowing what you know now, and and the things that we've discussed, like, yeah, how do you think it's influenced your creative process to everything that you do now? Is it a part of you? Is it a subconscious or thing, or are you consciously aware that you're implementing your knowledge now? into your work?
What a great question. I think it's kind of a both and. There are definitely moments, I think, like to work from your nakao, your heart, uh, your gut in that way. There's very much, you have to be really present in the moment, and you have to be able to hear and follow like the moment and your gut and what your gut is telling you about what's happening and how to document that, or whatever it is, like how to capture it, whatever it is in that moment. But also, especially coming from a film background, and my art practice has expanded beyond film and media now. Maybe not now, but like it's always kind of included a bit of textiles, but textiles and poetry, and like it's kind of become this ever expanding thing in terms of medium, but also trying to be really intentional about it because it is our values and our way of understanding the world as being deeply interconnected and deeply related to not just other humans, but to everything that is more than human, to our land, to our seas, to the creatures that walk around in the world, to this unseen spiritual world that is there and present, but that we might ignore. To understand that like all of that is happening in any context that you're making art. And from a filmmaking perspective, to uphold that relationship, that kinship that we have, to honor our kinship to the natural world around us, really takes intentionality, especially for someone like me who is institutionally trained. My filmmaking background did not prepare me for any of this. It's really the antithesis of everything that I learned about filmmaking. So I really try to be mindful about it now as much as I can to do this, right? Because I mean, filmmaking, especially documentary filmmaking, which is kind of where I've come from most, it's very extractive. You jump in, you ask exploitative questions, hard questions, you ask people to relive their trauma, you do all these things in the name of a good story, and then you just pop right back out, you put it out on film, and then you blast it out for everyone to see so that other people in other parts of the world can feel something and like have this kind of loose experience of a place or a people or a time. And that kind of filmmaking does not interest me at all. But it's also like kind of, there's a degree to which that's kind of my knee jerk reflex because that's my training. So I don't have to constantly undo all of that training. Like, how would I approach this if I understand myself as being in relationship and in kinship with this room, the plants around the room, the creatures around the outside, this person that I'm talking to, like how would I set up the image that we're recording? How do I conduct myself when I do the interview? How do I conduct myself afterwards? You know, is there follow-up? Am I making sure that they get, you know, more than just credit, but like, you know, like giving back in some fashion? Like there's just so many layers to it. We go on for hours about this particular topic.
No, I like it, and that was a sincere question as well because I do. I think I think our upbringing and our culture really does influence our day to day lives, and I don't think I was aware of that until recent times for myself. And so, in particular for you, that was a question that naturally sort of flowed into this space. So yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. And flowing also on from that, I guess, moving into your family, like, so, how does your family help you stay connected to your heritage? Are you, now with that new experience with your, with the experience you've shared with your dad and your brothers, yeah, how do you all, how does this all influence you? Has it influenced you, or has it influenced your brothers at all? Can you see that, has it made a difference for them?
Yeah, I think it's made a difference for all of us. We have now all my brothers and my sister. We've all been back at least one time to both the islands and to New Zealand, and I think probably all of us not to speak for them, but I think most or all of them would say it's been a very influential, was an influential trip at minimum, right? Maybe potentially life changing as it was for me. Yeah, there's just something that kind of shifts a little bit when you get to know that other part of your family that you didn't know. There's like a rootedness for me. I think that one of the things that came out of us being homeschooled, but then also being homeschooled with the parents that we had, my dad especially, like there was a lot of emphasis on family and closeness. And I can remember, being small and my dad kind of imparting on me. He's the eldest of his brothers. I'm the eldest of my family, and him saying, you're responsible for your siblings. Like they're your responsibility to look after, to take care of, and to mind. And I know sometimes in like westernized therapy culture, online stuff, like that's kind of really looked at and frowned upon as a lot. And, we could unpack that, but we are very close as siblings and we're very close as a family. And yeah, I think that retaining those relationships is a really big priority for each of us. And so that shifts how you handle conflict and disagreements and big changes in family dynamics. The family has grown. We have spouses, in-laws, and now we're getting to the stage where we're adding the tamariki, the grandchildren. So I think through all of those shifts and changes, our values, like as we as young people have explored our islandness more, I think it's also helped my dad to really embrace more of who he is. So like we love to. There's an annual festival here in San Diego. It's the biggest Pacific Islander festival, I think on the continent. Um, it's called PIFA, the Pacific Island Festival in San Diego. It's actually later this month in September every year. And so that's been a really big thing for our family to go. We've hosted the Cook Islands Village there, the cultural village, for the last, 8 or 9 years, since like longer, 10. I think 2013 is when I inherited that particular responsibility. And so for me to have these cultural responsibilities in community now, and like trying to bring my family in as much as they're willing to, and as much as we can.
That's super cool. We also just bumped into each other at the Festival of Pacific Arts in Hawaii, and so still on the same theme of connection and culture. How important do you think festivals like the festPAC is, and your PIFA? Did you say it was the Pacific
Yeah, PIFA.
Island Festival? PIFA, like, yeah, how important are these festivals for you and for our wider community in the diaspora? Yeah, how important is it? Are they?
Well, for the diaspora especially, is for Southern California, it's how we see everyone. Like there's people that I only see once a year at PIFA. There's another festival that I do in LA every year with the Cultural Village, and there are some folks that sometimes that's the only time I see them in a year. And so it's where you get your community. It's where we get the food and the music and the dancing and the different the different art forms. When you have practitioners come to visit, and of course, there's the commercial aspect of it as well. But like PIFA for us, and I can't remember now, it's been so long. I can't remember if we went to our first PIFA right before my brother and I went on our big first trip to meet the family, or right after. I think it was right before. And I remember walking in, we saw the cultural villages. It was much smaller because this was like over 20 years ago. But there was one that it's a Cook Islands Village, and I remember walking up and talking to Uncle Tapai, who I would later meet, like almost maybe 10-ish years later, 8 years later, and that's how I kind of got involved in the village. But didn't know it at the time and be like, this is so exciting. Like, we're from the Cook Islands and we're gonna go visit soon, and like this is amazing. And it was like one table with, some artifacts and crafts, and he was like, oh, okay, this is great. This is like very Americanized, these very Americanized kids coming up and being excited. And so that's why I participate and make sure that I bring the village out for folks, like, because maybe someone else is going to have that experience. So the festivals that we have every year for us in the diaspora, like, essential. That's where we all come together and get to celebrate our cultures without, it's where we get to come together and celebrate what's beautiful about our cultures. And then festPAC was like this whole other incredible experience. And I'm sure there are definitely things to critique about it. However, it was transformative. I'm so happy that I went and that I went for the full duration of the festival. I think as someone who has spent all of my life basically in these different diaspora locations, in these different diaspora communities, there's this real sense of like hierarchy and othering that happens in our communities, even at festivals, right? Like, it's easy to feel less than, to feel not enough of whatever island you might be from. And I know that people experience this on island too, but I will say, especially for the US diaspora here on the continent, like, we're so physically distant from other islands and other islanders, even, right? Like, my community, I live an hour minimum from any other large group of islands right now, because I live in my family home again. An hour minimum driving. Like, that's how long it's going to take for me to see other islanders and to be in community. So to be able to come to a place like festPAC that is not just the islands that you see and the communities that you see in Southern California who are predominantly here, right? There's not really any other Cook Islanders. I am almost always the only Cook Islander to show up to stuff in SoCal. But there's a lot of Samoans, there's a lot of Chamorro, and there's quite a few Tongans, and obviously a lot of Kanaka Maoli, right? So we have these groups that kind of get the big play and get seen a lot because their communities are bigger. But to be somewhere like festPAC and see everyone, well, almost everyone, okay, almost everyone, but to see way more than we see, and to just like, I fully lived for those 10 days or whatever it was of festPAC, of all my friends from SoCal being like, oh, we saw the Cook Islanders over there. Oh, these Cook Islanders over here. Oh, I met this, I'm buying this necklace from the Cook Islands booth. Oh, like, it was just like they were getting to fully experience my island in a way that they don't get to here in California. And that was special for me. And I loved, like, we rocked up to the opening ceremonies and we were in the parking lot and I heard singing and I went, those are the Cook Islanders. That's our delegation. I can't see them, but I can hear them and I just know it. And sure enough, we came into sight of all of the delegations who were filing into the arena, and that was us. I was like, ha, I knew it. I knew that was us. So yeah, it was amazing. And then, there's politics going on, of course. Like, it's political to be a Pacific Islander, but even that, to hear other Pacifica people, empowering other Pacifica people, uplifting the struggles, uplifting the challenges that different areas have to navigate, was just to hear everyone's languages, to hear their music, just be walking around and be like, oh, here's the Solomon Islands. I had never heard any Solomon Islands music before. Incredible. And so unique in the Pacific, right? So yeah, it was a magical experience, is what I thought about festPAC.
Me te ki mata, thank you so much, Melodie, for joining us on the podcast this week. If you'd like to know more about Melodie or just stay up to date with what she's doing, check out her socials in the description below. Also, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on YouTube and on the Tupe Dreams website for more content. Come back soon for another episode of What's in Your Kete podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Ka kite.